It's a political victory that our country has never seen before, nothing like this. I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president.
Donald Trump has beaten Kamala Harris in a bitter presidential election, one which has further deepened the U.S. political divide. What will this election mean for the U.S., Asia, and the rest of the world? How will the new president confront a host of problems, such as wars, rising geopolitical tensions, economic headwinds, and climate change?
Welcome to a special edition of Insight, where we unpack the results and the implications of the 2024 U.S. elections. I'm Genevieve Wu, and joining me today for a panel discussion are Professor Joseph Liao, Dean, College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, Nanyang Technological University. Drew Thompson, Senior Fellow, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Angela Mancini, Partner, Head of Geopolitical Risks, APAC Control Risks. And last but not least, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow, Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore. Thank you for joining me today, and let's go straight into the results. The polls had said that it was going to be a tight race, too close to call. What are your feelings about the outcome, that it came out bright and early? Joseph?
Well, lesson one, don't trust the polls. But jokes aside, I think what is interesting is if you cast your mind back to 2016, just before the election then, if you were to ask many Americans, certainly many Singaporeans, what are the chances of Donald Trump winning the election? I mean, you would be hard-pressed to find a lot of people who would think that he had a chance. Fast forward, just before this election, I think certainly in Singapore, you'll be hard-pressed to find Singaporeans who didn't believe that he would come back into the White House. Yeah? So in that sense, I think it wasn't necessarily a big surprise, but there are some interesting developments with regards to the data that we've seen so far, the extent of his victory in terms of the popular vote, the likely sweep of the Senate and the House as well. Mm-hmm. I think there is very clearly a story there that everyone needs to get a hold of and really understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. True.
There was a lot of passion around this election, and I think many people strongly felt one way or the other about the candidate. And I think we see that sharp divide between supporters of one party or the other. But I think what pleased me about the outcome was the process itself. The fact that we did have a quick conclusion, that it was decisive, that democracy worked. And I think that probably is a really important signal, not just for what does this mean for the United States, but what it means for the world as a functioning model of governance. And now we'll watch carefully how the transition takes place.
Angela, your thoughts?
Yeah, what I find interesting is if you look at the statistics of around her campaign, the money she raised, which was record-breaking, the Get Out the Vote campaign, which was record-breaking, it was pretty extraordinary. And if you look at the enthusiasm that her voters had, including in the days in the run-up to the election, the Democrats really thought they had this. You know, I had some people say in the bag. Similarly, the Republicans thought they had it in the bag. So what I take away is both sides really thought they would win. Of course, we've seen a result that was a lot less close than we expected. But I think what that tells us is, indeed, there's been a shift rightward with the body politic. And you can have a conversation if that's around values or policy. So I think the Democrats and the body politic really need to think about the messages that are being told, the issues that really resonated, and how we move forward now from here.
Sure. Kishore.
The United States hasn't been as badly divided as it is today for a long time. And the divisions are very, very real. And it's very clear that what I would call the liberal East Coast establishment doesn't understand its own country at all. They completely lost touch with the people, especially in their heartlands. And none of them expected or predicted this kind of solid Trump victory. I think this is why we have to sort of figure out how is it the best educated, the most affluent middle class just lost touch with their working classes in their country.
So speaking of a decisive victory, which we all agree on, what was it, do you think, that was the one main message that resonated, that I suppose, coalesced the entire electorate so quickly?
Well, I think one of the key issues was the economy and the argument that the Republicans, that Donald Trump was putting forward, that he would handle the economy better. And that resonated with people who were struggling with everyday cost of living issues. Yeah? The macro data looked good, economic growth, job creation. But if you get down to the weeds, that's where you realize that a lot of people, I think, were sort of not feeling that they were benefiting from this apparent growth and boom in the U.S. economy.
I jump in and add, I think that's exactly right. And I think there's an issue between what the data says in terms of the economic recovery, which is happening, and the lived experience. So whether, when people drive past the gas station every day and they see the gas prices, even though they're at 3-year lows, it feels expensive to fill the car. You go to the grocery store, it feels that cost of living, has gone up. So I think that's a real issue. And I'd also add, with the advent of AI and technology, we're also seeing increasing job loss in the professional class as well. So I think it's a more broad-based economic concern and pocketbook issues.
I think that's the key. The big theme for this election was really dissatisfaction. And I think there was dissatisfaction on both sides, and that really hampered the incumbent. So I think it's been well discussed that Vice President Harris had a very difficult time distancing herself from the incumbent and the party in power. So a lot of that dissatisfaction went to her. But I think the dissatisfaction is across the board, as Joseph said, with the economy, as Angela said, with people's sense of security, personal security in terms of income, inflation. So I think across the board there was great dissatisfaction, and that's what the polls said. And clearly, Trump's mantra of change, of disruption, was appealing to a majority of the voters.
And Kamala Harris could not, I suppose, represent that change.
I think one of the real challenges of her race was really defining what she stood for. Yeah. You could see a sort of arc of narrative that went back and forth between juxtaposition of her versus Trump. There was a lot, and that was kind of where some of the Democratic issues, she's the candidate for democracy, he's the criminal. That didn't resonate well, so then they switched, and then it became grocery bills, and that didn't stick, and then it just kept trying to find its voice, and it never really did. So we had a figure, but we really didn't have a bumper sticker and a narrative to hang on it.
Well, I think Drew is right. There was a lot of dissatisfaction. And I think 3 I words are the sources of the dissatisfaction. And Trump captured all 3 brilliantly. One, immigration. People could feel it, around them, the sense of insecurity you're referring to, Drew. And the Democrats didn't realize how much angst that was causing. And Trump was hitting the right drum. And then there's that second I word is inflation. And certainly, when Joe Biden pumped, 1.9 trillion or whatever it is, which is good for the economy, but it also stimulated inflation. And for the Biden administration to pretend that inflation wasn't real, people could feel it's real. So there was a disconnect there. And the third I word, I would say, is identity. And here the wokeness of the Democratic crowd, all these he, she, they, them, they completely alienated the ordinary people. And one point that people can't speak about, because it's sort of politically incorrect to speak too loudly about it, is that many American males felt that masculinity was under threat in the United States. And this may explain how you have this spectacular divergence whereby Kamala Harris may end up getting 14 million votes less than Joe Biden. 14 million. What explains that huge gap?
All right. So now that we know that President-elect Donald Trump will be in office as the 47th president, as well as he was the 45th president, what can we expect the difference to be, a Trump 1.0 and a Trump 2.0?
But last time he came to power, two things were happening. One, he did have advisors around him who were traditionalists, the quote-unquote adults in the room. Those are now gone. And number two, he didn't really have a plan. He's not an ideologue, really. And so some of the early policy making, erratic, felt a bit of seat of the pants, things switched around. Now, as we know, it's been heavily reported that between the Heritage Foundation and the American First Policy Foundation, there are quite a lot of policies in place. So I think he'll hit the ground running. And I also think he comes back with a bit of a chip on his shoulder for some of the domestic enemies, and that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
I think, of course, one concern, as was pointed out, is the composition of his team. And whereas previously there were some more traditionalist type of policymakers from the Republican side of the House in the team. We really have to wait and see whether the Trump 2.0 is going to still have that element, or he's really going to sort of a major shift away from that.
I think it's always hazardous to predict how President Trump is going to govern, react, respond, and I think that's a feature, not a bug. Right? Yep. But what I think you're going to see, in addition to sort of the thematic issues, is really a very activist president, very involved president, involved in very big issues. He's going to challenge convention. He's going to take risks. He's not risk averse at all. He's a business person. He risks capital to make it. And I think that's his mindset. So it's difficult to predict. I think Trump's going to go at big challenges. And that's going to create chaos. And some people will be very happy about that chaos, and some people will not be.
Well, I know. I think in one way or another, he'll definitely surprise us. That I guarantee you. Because he never conforms to any kind of the norms that other presidents would conform to. And, when I was in the U.S. recently, what struck me was the number of CEOs I spoke to who were very pro-Trump because they thought he'd be good for business, right? Less taxes, less regulation, and less wars. All these three things are good for business. So if he may actually end up delivering 4 years of good economic growth, and that would be a big surprise to all of us.
All right, on that note, we'll take a short break. And when we come back, we will continue with our analysis of the 2024 U.S. elections. And we're going to talk about foreign policy and China. Stay tuned.
A raging trade war between the United States and China. Tensions in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. And questions about the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. Where will Donald Trump stand on these contentious issues?
Welcome back. You're watching a special episode of Insight when we unpack the results of the 2024 U.S. presidential election. Now, on foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, the biggest relationship to watch is on U.S. and China. They are strategic rivals on many levels, on trade, on technology, on influence, on who has more friends. Trump 1.0 started a trade war with China. What's going to happen with Trump 2.0?
Well, remember that when Donald Trump surprisingly won in 2016, even before he took office, one of the early visitors he had was Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago. And everyone thought, wow, maybe the U.S.-China relations might have a wonderful 4 years. So as you know, the opposite happened. Donald Trump started the trade war with China. So I have absolutely no doubt, because the U.S.-China contest is driven, by structural forces. It's not driven by personalities. It's one power becoming stronger, the other power pushing the other power down. So there's no question there'll be a lot of head-butting between U.S. and China in the first 2 years. But I also predict that after maybe 1 or 2 years of head-butting, at the end of the day, Trump is still a very pragmatic person. So he's not as ideologically opposed to China in the way that the Biden administration was. The Biden administration had a kind of ideological bent in their policies towards China. He has no such ideology. At the end of the day, if he thinks what he's going to do is going to make America strong, I'll make a deal with China. So that's the paradox of Donald Trump vis-a-vis China.
On his campaign trail, he's also already said that he will increase tariffs on China up to even 60% or even more. What do you make of that?
I think if you go back and look at his last administration, he didn't just start a war with China over trade. He used the threat of tariffs to entice China to the negotiating table, and he entered into very long, drawn-out, good faith negotiations to try to create a more equitable, sustainable trade relationship, which didn't feature massive deficits, that increased U.S. access to a very closed Chinese market and a level playing field. And they negotiated hard. And an agreement was reached, but it wasn't approved by the Politburo and Xi Jinping. And then the threatened tariffs stuck. So I could foresee a Trump administration using those threats of massive tariffs, because that's how Trump rolls, right? But the question is, can Xi Jinping compromise when he has an industrial policy that really precludes opening up his markets? When they're on a campaign for resiliency and self-sufficiency, made in China 2025, dual circulation, this is written into their 5-year plans. So they can't just negate their existing strategy and framework to make concessions to the United States. So it's going to be a very, very difficult negotiation. And the question is he going to try?
And just to add to that, if I may, I agree that there is a predominant structural dynamic at work. But the interesting thing also is we know that Trump personalizes foreign policy, and he likes to believe that it's part of the so-called art of the deal, right? And he says that he has a very good personal relationship with Xi Jinping. And on China's side, we know that Xi Jinping is certainly far more influential in decision-making than his predecessors were in a personal way as well. So it'll be interesting to see how Trump balances that out with the sort of structural dynamics that are very much at work between a rising China and incumbent United States.
All right. So what are some of the key issues then that will define the U.S.-China bilateral relationship going forward?
The thing we're watching for, obviously, it's going to be trade. The issue is the Biden administration had the, of course, high fence, narrow yard mentality, which was very targeted, tariffs on very specific sectors. Trump's history is that it'll be blunt policy tools, wider tariffs. But then I'm also looking at the third countries, because I do think that, especially if we have a complete Republican control of Congress, I think you're going to see more scrutiny on countries in the region, like Vietnam and Malaysia, as they have relationships with China that may involve Chinese investment into those countries to then export onwards into the U.S. I think those will be under scrutiny more, right at a time when the U.S. may also really want to be keeping them on side for security reasons. So it's, in some, I'd say it's quite complex. It's going to be trade related, but I think trade will move quite quickly into security.
All right.
Can I add one point? I would add what I call the Elon Musk factor. Because Elon Musk is clearly somebody who's developed some kind of personal relationship with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump has to send a thank you note to Elon Musk for his success. At the same time, Elon Musk is also the businessman who negotiated one of the most successful manufacturing deals in China. He knows what China's manufacturing capabilities are. And I've also spoken to some CEOs who are aware that even for American industry, if you want to go back to manufacturing, you still need to get the inputs and some technology in manufacturing from China. So there are actually realistic, pragmatic CEOs around also who will play a kind of role quietly behind the scenes, by the way. No one wants to be upfront saying, hey, I'm for working with China. But behind the scenes, there'll be the Elon Musk and others who will say, okay, we got to go head-to-head against China, but in some areas, we still got to work with China.
Now, Trump, on his campaign speech, had said, campaign trail, had said that he will make Taiwan pay for its security. Now, how seriously should we take this comment, and what are the implications of that?
I think if you look at how Trump approaches alliances in general, he wants to increase the contributions of those alliance partners. I think the more conventional way of framing that is burden sharing, whether it's Japan, South Korea, NATO, right? He wants allies to be more involved, but also contribute back to the alliance, so they're not just free riding. Right? So when he says he wants other countries to pay, he's asking them to really contribute more to their own defense. So in a way, this is an actual opportunity for Taiwan and other countries to really demonstrate their own commitment to their own security and the contributions they make to an alliance towards an open, inclusive international order. And if you look, Taiwan has doubled its defense spending in the last 10 years in the Tsai Ing-wen administration. They are changing their defense strategies to make themselves more resilient, both as a society and an economy, as well as defense. So there's tremendous defense changes taking place in Taiwan that I think benefit the United States as well. The question is, are we going to see those same sorts of evolutions or maybe transformations in Europe? And I'm very doubtful.
Right.
Actually, if I can just add to that, on this issue of burden sharing, I think if you look at how the Europeans have tried to adjust or have struggled to adjust to that compared to East Asia, I think it's quite interesting because it's not something unexpected, right? I mean, it was being signaled by Trump 1.0 already. If you look at East Asia, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Japan, whether it's Korea, Singapore, Philippines, the countries in the region have, in a sense, taken it in their stride. It's not their preferred context and situation, but they have adapted, I think, much more effectively than Europeans.
Well, I agree with Drew that the Taiwanese have stepped up their activities and so on and so forth. But at the same time, I mean, Joe Biden was very categorical, right?
Stability across the Taiwan Straits.
We will defend Taiwan. We will defend Taiwan 4 times, removing the strategic ambiguity. I don't think Donald Trump is ever going to say directly, I'm going to defend Taiwan. At the end of the day, everything for him is a chip, a card on the table that he can negotiate with. And so Taiwan is going to become a negotiating chip. And that's not something I, as a Taiwanese, would be very happy about.
Moving closer to this part of the world, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that's the IPEF. Now, Trump dumped the Trans-Pacific Partnership when he came into office, 2016. And what will be the fate of IPEF and the consequences this time around?
I tell you, if the IPEF dies, no one will notice.
It's already dead.
Because there's nothing there.
Already dead.
I mean, there's no trade component. There's nothing there. So even if Trump kills it, he's not killing anything active at all.
There's nothing much to kill.
All right. On that note, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk about global conflicts and the U.S. role in this under a new president. Stay tuned.
And we will make America great again.
Donald Trump will inherit a multitude of conflicts when taking office on January 20th, 2025. Right now, there is an escalating war in the Middle East. Meanwhile, North Korea's involvement has complicated the Russia-Ukraine war. How will Trump deal with multiple global flashpoints?
Thanks for staying with us. You're watching a special episode of Insight. Now, President-elect Donald Trump faces a much changed global situation than the one that Joe Biden came into 4 years ago. Let's start off with the Ukraine-Russia war. What has Trump said about this, and what's going to happen in Trump 2.0 on this issue?
I think I'll jump in there and say I think this is one we'll see pretty immediate movement on of all the ones that are at play. And we have had Trump on the campaign trail say that he would end the war on day one. I don't know that that's, number one, possible, and number two, would be possible in a way that would make sense and be palatable to the Ukrainian side, because it sounds like it's more of a maybe frozen conflict and then negotiate from there. But I do think there's a couple of interesting things to watch there. Number one, I do think it's going to be harder for the U.S. to just drop any aid because legislation's been put in place to prohibit that from being so easy. Number two, watch for the U.S. defense companies, because there's actually quite a business there of their own production ramping up, and I reckon that their lobbyists are also going to be, speaking to the new administration about not winding that down so quickly. And there is some fractions in the Republican Party on that issue. There's been a lot of the more traditionalist Republicans going in the media and saying, listen, why would we stop this? If we consider Russia a geopolitical enemy, which in the States it historically is, why wouldn't we support Ukraine? If we stop now, what is Russia's next move?
Just to follow up on Angela's point, I think that the question is going to be who's going to pay for the equipment that the United States and the defense industry is prepared to continue sending. Yeah? And of course, Trump is going to look to the Europeans to do that, and the Europeans might feel that they don't have a choice. The interesting thing about the Trump administration, as far as the president is concerned, is going to be the fact that he's going to be looking at it from a very personal angle, which sometimes will be at odds with the larger strategic objectives of the United States. And he's totally comfortable with that. And he believes that he can manage that. Yeah. So I don't think that he will have a problem developing that personal relationship with Putin, and Xi Jinping for that matter, while at the same time the administration, talks a very hard line about it, continues to support the Ukrainians. To him, there's no inconsistency there at all.
You're right. In the case of Donald Trump, the personal factor is very important. And one of the most important personal factors here is that he doesn't like Zelensky. He believes that Zelensky badly let him down in the 2020 elections. He knew that Zelensky had some dirt on Hunter Biden, didn't share it with Donald Trump. And for Donald Trump, for those who've done business with him, they know there's payback time. So there's a personal dimension here. And he was so amazingly tough on the Iraq war, saying it was a complete waste of time and money. He said that categorically. I think he feels the same about the Ukraine war. And so in that sense, I think the pressure to stop the war, he wants to show that, I suspect, for himself as an early win, I stopped the war. Because at the end of the day, if he stops the war today and you freeze the situation as it is today, then clearly in one way or another it's a win for Russia.
Picking up your point about Iraq, and let's move on to the Middle East. What started in the Gaza war was between Israel and Hamas Hezbollah, but this has clearly escalated, and now Iran is in the picture. We've known that Trump 1.0, he pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. What's going to happen now in the Middle East, now that Trump is back in power and Iran is in play?
I think the thing to watch is going to be how he handles Iran and the proxies. And one conflict that I think is worth really watching is how he handles the Houthis and the Red Sea security issue, right? Which affects trade, which affects sea lanes, and which I think the Biden administration and the Obama administration before that, and the first Trump administration all played very defensively. And we've seen a real threat to international commerce, shipping, supported by Iran. But very little reaction. We've been shooting missiles being fired at us with not much ground game. And we've actually prevented the Saudis from going in on the ground and actually affecting change. And if you look at how Trump dealt with ISIS compared to the Obama administration, right, Trump is not worried about the risks. He's focused on the effects. So he's, I think, prepared to delegate authority to military officials to go and resolve problems like he did in Syria, like he did with ISIS.
I think I'll jump in and say, I think another interesting angle to watch when we think about the Middle East, of course, is Israel. Because, Netanyahu and Trump have a strong relationship, apparently. I think historically, the U.S. has thought their own foreign policy priorities would take precedent. And they're going to be kind of driving the agenda, driving the outcomes, driving negotiations. I don't think that's the case in this scenario. I think especially early on in the Trump administration, I think we're going to see Israel continuing to make more of the decisions of what they're doing. I think the presence of kind of what U.S. wants is diminished there.
I would add one more point here. One of his few major foreign policy success in his first term was Abraham Accords 1.0. So I think he's going to go for Abraham Accords 2.0, which means a deal with Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis are very keen on a deal. But given the temperature in the Islamic world about the Gaza issue, you have to get something for the Palestinians. And one thing that actually Trump has been going around saying is that I can deal with that situation. And he's also said categorically, I can stop the war in the Middle East. And if that's one issue that made Biden look extremely weak, Biden and Blinken, was what happened in Gaza. What will make Trump look very strong is if he can stop the war.
Moving quickly to this part of the world then, South China Sea and I guess the Indo-Pacific region as a whole, how do you think the new administration will view this part of the world?
I don't think that the South China Sea will be a priority, but at the same time, if the larger picture is to intensify this rivalry and competition with China, then the South China Sea cannot be at least part of that larger picture. But I don't think that Trump has any interest in getting involved in any sort of conflagration in the South China Sea. I think that much is certain.
I'd add in there, I agree with that, and I also think that I talked to a lot of corporate clients. We've been doing scenario planning for corporate clients for months, regardless of who's going to win, on some areas, including the South China Sea. And I think the issue there is, again, I don't think anyone's spoiling for a fight in that region specifically. The risk is the miscalculation, the miscommunication, right? So again, we're in a world now where supply chains are, business world is more interconnected than ever, and there's less room for error. That would also impact business.
Because under the Biden administration, they were careful and were willing to set up guardrails, right, in terms of preventing miscommunication, miscalculation. Will a Trump 2.0 be interested in those guardrails, given his penchant for volatility?
My personal view is that they should be, right? And again, it will depend on his advisors. I don't think there's a reason why they would want to step away from that. But I think, again, with the Trump administration, we just know we're going to have more unpredictability than we've had in the past. So it just opens up that aperture a little bit more for potential miscalculations or miscommunications in a world where we have a lot less room for error than we had in his first administration.
What about trade and security concerns in the Indo-Pacific region as a whole?
It's not so much what Trump thinks, it's about the people whom he selects. President Biden had a personal interest in Southeast Asia. Kamala Harris had personal interest in Southeast Asia, but Donald Trump doesn't, frankly. For him, Southeast Asia is not that important. He was going to focus on the big picture, with China, Russia, and all those big issues, Middle East. But Southeast Asia is not going to be of much concern to him. So who he selects as Assistant Secretary of State for this region will make a big difference.
If Southeast Asian states, if the Philippines, if Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, if they approach the Trump administration with a proactive agenda that advocates for more U.S. attention, investment, that's willing to open up their markets for U.S. investment, U.S. presence, then I think there'd be a great deal of interest. The challenge is, how can you be invested in a region that's hedging, that doesn't want to choose sides? When you declare that you don't want to choose sides, you're demonstrating that you have nothing to gain, but also nothing to lose. So you become a low order of priority because it's just static. But if there's opportunity to strengthen and deepen relationships, it's not just President Trump, that's in the American DNA, to go and strengthen your partnerships. They want to be the security partner of choice, the economic partner of choice.
Under the Trump administration, some Southeast Asian countries are going to come under heavier scrutiny because of their economic relationships with China. So in that sense, yes, we want more American attention, but at the same time, that attention can manifest in different forms, right? Including scrutiny of, okay, so what are you doing about this China issue? Yeah, and whether Southeast Asian countries and the United States under Trump are aligned in terms of how to respond to that, I think that's a question to ask. Another point, as far as trade and economics is concerned, I think the issue is really going to be at a bilateral level between the United States and regional countries. And over and above that, it's about what regional countries, what value proposition regional countries have to offer to the Trump administration.
But at the same time, you look at the statistics, global trade flows are still growing. And, many countries in the world are still increasing their trade with each other. In fact, yesterday I was talking to Jonathan Kaplan, the U.S. ambassador to Singapore, And he said to me, this year, United States will do more trade with Singapore than Singapore does with China. So, trade is growing. So in that sense, even though the multilateral system is under challenge, the countries are still willing to open up their economies and trade more and do more, because at the end of the day, they do know that with trade comes growth. And that's why Southeast Asia, for example, is very pro-trade and one of the most open areas in the world for trade.
The U.S. is Singapore's largest trading partner in services and has been for 20 years since the FTA was signed. Largest investor. Probably that makes them the largest employer outside of government-linked companies and the government itself. But Singapore's not the challenge, right? This is an open economy. Indonesia is the challenge. Malaysia is pretty open too, right? But how do you break into Thailand? Are you required to do joint venture partners in those countries? And that's maybe not palatable to American investors. And that's where the trade will come from. So I think that's where you could see some potential drive, because he is going to bring in Lighthisers. He's going to bring in trade negotiators and lawyers, and they're going to look at the details, and they'll drive for it if they want to, if the partners want to. It's not coercive.
All right, we're going to hold it right there. And speaking of changes, what will happen to U.S. as a global leader? We'll talk about that when we come back after the break. Welcome back. You're watching a special edition of Insight. Now, in Trump's first term, his mantra was America first. Under that, it appeared that U.S. was getting isolationist. He was estranged from NATO. He pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. Now that he's once again commander-in-chief, what will happen to these alliances? What happens to Quad? What happens to AUKUS? Does he have an appetite for such alliances?
Maybe I'll start. First, I don't think that I totally agree that he was isolationist. I think in many respects that is a bit of a mischaracterization of it. He was certainly different in how he conducted foreign policy, but he was pretty muscular on the Middle East, on Syria, pretty activist on North Korea, China. The Quad, which you mentioned, was something that he will certainly claim ownership of, as is the concept of the Indo-Pacific. So I don't think in that respect he really was that isolationist. But granted, he wasn't a fan of multilateral commitments, hence that list that you went through. Going forward, I think it's going to be much of the same as far as Trump's worldview and how he feels he needs to approach the world is concerned. It will be very much about relationships, both personal as well as bilateral. It will be there will be that transactional element and dimension to it, which we all know and have experienced already. So I think these will be the key features. And the last thing I'll say, of course, is that a lot also depends on who his team is going to be and how they would want to conduct the sort of nuts and bolts of foreign policy.
I agree with what Joseph just said, and I'll add another angle as well, and that is the bilateral relationship on the other side. So as we know, we've talked about it, Trump, of course, is transactional, has a preference for bilateral relationships, has a preference for very personal relationships. So when you think about something like the Quad, how does his relationship with Modi in India go? We would think it would go well, but if something happens and it doesn't, that might then portend some change to the level of priority the U.S. might put on something like the Quad. I'm also looking at what happens in Europe, because he has strong relationships with far-right populists like Viktor Orban. And I think when he thinks about Europe, it's less in the NATO construct and the alliance construct than in that bilateral construct. And what's interesting is the personal relationships that he may value may not all sit in the same place in terms of where the constructs are. So I think how that plays out will be interesting. And then also, as we see the continued rise of the far right in places like France and Germany, how does that then play into some of the important European bilateral relationships, which of course then impact some of the alliances? Sure.
Well, I agree with when you say that Trump is not isolationist. But as someone who was ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, I can tell you the UN can take a holiday for 4 years. Because clearly the one thing that Donald Trump has no time for is global multilateral institutions, from Paris Accords, from UNESCO, Human Rights Commission, And certainly global multilateral institutions. Unfortunately, the UN is led by a very weak Secretary General today. He's not going to be strong enough to stand up to Donald Trump. The only people who might possibly counterbalance Donald Trump in this area are the Europeans, because the Europeans actually genuinely, sincerely believe in multilateral institutions. They believe in negotiating accords. They believe in the Paris climate accords very deeply. So that's where if there's any possibility of anyone trying to tell Donald Trump, hey, don't give up on every global multilateral institutions, you have to see whether the Europeans step up to the plate.
In his heart, he's a businessman, and business people don't measure inputs, they measure the outputs. Right? And I think, unfortunately, often in diplomacy, you get that input focus. We had a meeting, we have an organization, institution. We don't focus on what it achieved. And I think that's what Trump focuses on. So, yes, if the United Nations took a holiday for 4 years, would we even notice? But Trump is looking to have an effect. He's looking to make change. As we started this conversation, he's a change agent. And I think that can be very disruptive, whether it's positive or negative. That could be just perspective. So I think we all agree there will be a strong bilateral diplomatic relationship built by the United States in a network throughout the world. But multilateral institutions, if they want Trump's attention, they're going to have to step up their game, and they're going to have to actually ask themselves, what is their actual value proposition? And is the United States central to it? I mean, that doesn't mean that ASEAN isn't valuable as an organization, and ASEAN centrality is real. But it's designed to do some things, but it's not designed to do other things. So if it's things that the U.S. is willing to do and invest in, there's other mechanisms, there's other modalities. And I think that's where the U.S. is not losing leadership, it's not reverting inwardly. It's just not going to follow convention.
Okay. Coming full circle about the U.S. elections. Now, the bitter and contentious race this time showed up a very divided United States. Now, addressing this will be critical, I think, to the country's resilience. In his victory speech, Trump talked about healing the nation. What does he mean by that? What will be his priorities? Is he truly interested in what he said?
Can I say this, that while some of the healing may have to come from Donald Trump to reach out to the other side, I think it's equally important for the liberal East Coast establishment, which shunned him and treated him with absolute contempt, right? And the words they use against him, he's a fascist, he's a dictator. I think the other side has also got to decide how they come to terms with the fact that Americans voted for Donald Trump. And by the way, this is one of the most spectacular election results, He won the presidency. More importantly, he won the popular vote. He also won the Senate. And if he wins the House, that's an amazing clean sweep. Plus, the judiciary is also with him. He's going to become one of the most powerful presidents ever. But if the other side refuses to accept him with any degree of legitimacy, then there's a danger the civil war may continue.
I think he sure makes a great point about the Democratic Party needing to think about how the results were so different than what they expected. But I think to your point about being, going towards unity, we've never seen that before with Donald Trump. I'm interested to see what is his inauguration speech, how does he govern? But again, as recently as the days running up to the election, when they put the comic on the stage that made utterly racist and divisive comments to a public that, they allowed that to happen. I think if he really wants, and let's see, we can't predict the future, but if he really wants to unify the country, there needs to be a radical rethink in how Trump and the people around him define how they actually go out and reach a swath of the people.
All right. And on that note, I'm going to ask you for perhaps one final observation or key takeaway that you had from this election. Let's start with Kishore.
Well, I'm going to end with a paradoxical statement. Donald Trump can be crazy. He can do crazy things. He can go and meet Kim Jong-un. So he might do something equally crazy like that. But he's not mad. At the end of the day, I think he's a rational actor. And if other countries can find a ways and means of reaching out to him and communicating with him, I think at the end of the day, he'll go for the art of the deal and compromise and make pragmatic adjustments.
I'm watching the economy. I mean, obviously that was a massive issue for voters, probably the top issue. And he's outlined plans that economists say actually aren't really going to fix the problem, but maybe they will. But I'm really interested to see when we're 2 years down, when we're at the midterm elections, how did that economy perform?
I think it's very disappointing as an American to see the American polity very bifurcated, but also othering, as you point out, right? There's a real progressive, conservative antagonism that I think is harming the polity in the United States. And that's what I'd like to see change, but I'm not sure we have the means to do that. Social media is making discourse worse. So honestly, if I could ask for one thing, if I were the president, it would be to really reform social media and hold people accountable for their online voices so that we could have more civility and more of a movement back towards the center.
Well, for me, it's one word: disruption. We all have to brace ourselves for that. If I can borrow an American cultural metaphor, there are going to be a lot of curveballs. And we just have to adapt as best as we can to that.
On a note, thank you for joining me. And to those watching us, thank you for watching this special edition of Insight on the analysis of the 2024 U.S. presidential election.